Interpretive Theory, and I'd like to welcome you all to the opening lecture of the Modern Critical Theory lecture series. While social distancing requirements make it impossible to host in-person events this fall, one of the unexpected benefits has been that it opens up our events to a broader public outside the campus and the community. And I'm very pleased that we have so many participants for our opening event who are joining us from Korea, from England, and from cities across the US. The lecture series this year is coordinated with graduate seminars in art history, comparative and world literature, English, German, and Spanish and Portuguese. We also have, as always, faculty and students from other departments in the audience. So welcome to you all. Before I introduce our speaker and moderator for this lecture, I would like to quickly go over the format for this lecture. To preserve data and bandwidth, we have muted the audio and turned off the video for all the audience members. So please use the chat function to ask questions during the Q&A when we get to it. And to minimize distractions during the presentation, I also ask that you please hold off on using chat until we actually get to the Q&A sections. Professor Allais will be presenting her talk in 2 segments, roughly of 25 minutes, and it will be broken up with a Q&A session immediately following each segment. So the hope is that this will help to counter the Zoom fatigue of listening to a continuous lecture for about an hour. The question and answer sessions will be moderated by Professor Helga Barden from the philosophy department here at UIUC. And thank you so much for this, Helga. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Lucy Allais, whose research centers on topics of forgiveness, moral responsibility, freedom, justice, and Immanuel Kant's theoretical philosophy, particularly his metaphysics. She studied philosophy at the University of the Witwatersrand and completed her master's and PhD degrees at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. After lecturing at various Oxford colleges and at the University of Sussex, Professor Allais moved to Wits, where she is currently Professor of Philosophy, as well as Director of the Wits Center for Ethics. Since 2015, she has held the Henry Allison Chair of the History of Philosophy at the University of California at San Diego and holds joint appointments at Wits and UCSD. Her widely reviewed and praised book on Kant's metaphysics, Manifest Reality, won the North American Kant Society 2016 prize. She has more than 40 single-authored papers, many in internationally leading journals, such as the European Journal of Philosophy and the Journal of Moral Philosophy. And she has been a distinguished visitor and keynote speaker at many venues around the world. So I'm now going to hand it over to Professor Lucy Allais. We are delighted to have her here. A very warm welcome.
Thanks so much for that, Susan. I'm really happy to be joining this lecture series. So I'm going to talk about Immanuel Kant, who I think is an interesting figure given the topic of the rest of your seminar. So Kant is an incredibly important philosopher he wrote in an enormous number of areas of philosophy. His important background to the German idealist tradition culminating in Marx. He's also a crucial background for liberal political thought. He also wrote in all sorts of other areas like metaphysics that I work on. But Kant is centrally a philosopher of the European Enlightenment, a period in European thought that emphasizes human reason and autonomy, and the period in history when European nations were engaged in colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. So the tensions and contradictions are immediately obvious, I'm sure, to all of you. And I think that why I said that this is a particularly interesting figure given the rest of your seminar series is that I think that maybe for a generation of scholars in critical theory, Kant is the enemy. Kant is a stalking horse And a lot of the topics for the rest of the seminar series you're going to be having include figures who want to reject ideas supposed to be found in Kant, and to put it in a really sort of maybe caricatured form, but I think this is a real form, the idea of a supposedly unified, atomized, ahistorical liberal subject is an idea supposedly found in Kant, and an idea which, from the program of the rest of your series, I think something that a lot of the different thinkers are concerned with critiquing and rejecting. Now, I think that that's a caricature of Kant and not the best way of reading him. But even if you took that view of Kant, it would still, of course, be worth coming to terms with him. You also want to have a clear understanding of thoughts you want to reject. But what I want to try to persuade you of is that we should not be too sure that we already know exactly what is in this philosophy. Immanuel Kant's critical philosophy is extremely complex and difficult, as those of us who spend our careers trying to understand it know very well. And I want to try to convince you that there's a lot to be learned from rethinking this philosophy with critical rigor, and that doing this is important to understanding where we are and where we can go. So working out where someone like Kant went wrong is an important part of the history of ideas, and important for thinking about ways in which our own positions may be compromised and may go wrong. Let's see. Okay, so I want to be looking at Kant together with the philosopher Charles Mills. So as you will have seen from the reading, I've given you 3 different readings from Charles Mills. So I want to look at 3 moments in Mills in relation to Kant. So Mills is an amazingly prolific philosopher, so he's written on all sorts of different things. But he's engaged in an enormous amount of Kant. And I want to separate out 3 different sort of moments of his engagement with Kant. So the first will be Kant's racism. The second will be looking at Kant as a proponent of what's called ideal theory in political philosophy. And then the third will be, and you might find those all sort of surprising combinations of ideas, but Black radical liberalism, Black radical Kantianism, and Occupy liberalism are all titles of papers by Mills. So I want to look at all 3 of those ideas. So we're framing this around the idea of Kant's racism, and I'll also just mention a little bit about his, so Kant is a racist, but he also has a theory of race. And his theory of race is really important for understanding the modern concept of race. And I think actually also for thinking about racism. And I think it's also really interesting, as this is one of the central things I want to try to persuade you of, for rethinking what we understand by liberalism. For the word liberal, I already mentioned this idea of the ahistorical, atomized, unified, transparent liberal subject. The word liberal, it's an amazingly disputed term, what it even is supposed to mean. So I come from South Africa, where the word liberal means right wing. And in America, the United States, in large parts of the population, it seems that the word liberal means extremely left wing, although there is also, and I'm going to be looking at this, a left critique of liberalism. And I was recently asking a UK friend what the word liberal means in politics in the UK, and she said it means roughly centrist. So it seems that we've covered the entire political spectrum with the concept of liberalism, and I think it's worth rethinking what it's even supposed to be, and Immanuel Kant is a really foundational figure for thinking about that. Okay, so we've got these 3 moments in Mills on Kant, and the first of those is thinking about Kant's racism. So Kant's philosophy, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, focuses centrally on trying to give a priori, so non-empirical, accounts of the conditions of the possibility of various human phenomena. So it's this super abstract, non-empirical, this is where you can see those ideas about it being asituated come in. And he tries to do this with all areas of philosophy: metaphysics, empirical knowledge, moral reason, just political authority. He tries to understand the basic conditions of these things. And these conditions are presented as if they are meant to be humanly universal, so to apply equally to all humans. Kant says, for example, in his moral philosophy and his political philosophy, that all humans have dignity and deserve respect, that this is the ground of morality, and that all humans have a right to equal freedom, and that securing and enabling this is the ground of justified political authority. Kant also has racist and sexist views that seem incompatible with regarding all humans as equal. So this obviously leaves us with a number of questions about how to interpret these views. And one immediate sort of critical thought we can see moving towards is a critique of, so we've got these claims which are meant to be universal, abstract, unsituated. And so one way we could respond to this is reject that kind of approach, the attempt to have unsituated abstractions and universalism. So Kant so I want to come back to that idea. So Kant has got this moral theory centered around the idea of human freedom and equality, which argues inflexibly that it's always wrong to treat a person as a means and to fail to respect their humanity. But for at least most of his professional life, Kant was a racist who did not express opposition to race-based slavery. Also, Kant has a theory of race. Okay, so this is fairly striking situation. We've got this, I think even if you hate Kant and think he's the enemy, I think he is undeniably brilliant, a brilliant philosopher, developing a theory about morality that he takes to be revolutionary and politics, and that's based on human equality and autonomy, which is itself something fairly new and revolutionary in this period. And despite these supposedly universal features of his a priori moral theory, Kant has racist and sexist views that are actually incompatible with regarding all human beings as moral equals. And his ideas do seem to have improved over time. He becomes less racist as his work develops. But certainly contemporaneously with his central universal moral theory, he expresses racism. And this leaves us with questions about how to think about him. And I think this is just a broader question in the history of philosophy and the history of ideas. What do we do with, and how do we read these thinkers who have been so influential and so venerated, and yet have some incredibly offensive and we think incredibly wrong views? Now, Kant, as I just mentioned, is also a sexist, and I'm not going to talk about his sexism at all. You actually at your university have the world's leading expert on this topic, so you are lucky that if you want to learn more about that, you can ask Helga Varden about that. Okay, so this sort of striking contradiction apparent contradiction between Kant's moral theory and his racism can leave us with a lot of different questions. How did Kant understand his views? Did he intend his moral theory to apply only to white men? Can we extricate his theories from his racism? Would critique of his racism and of racism have to come from outside of his theoretical framework? And more generally, how should we read racist and sexist figures in the tradition? Should we read them? Should we just abandon all these dead white men with their offensive thoughts? So I just want to note, it is important, I think, to note that Kant's racist views were very much not what everybody in his context at the time thought. Kant went out of his way to debate with someone, Georg Forster, who had had far more experience of Black people than he had had, who questioned his theory of race, who argued for abolitionism and defended the equality of the races. And he didn't think of his views on race as what everybody thought. He thought of his theory of race as new and important, just as he thought of many of the central ideas of his critical corpus, which he thought of as self-consciously revolutionary. So some people like to respond by saying like, oh, well, can we criticize people when isn't it just what everybody thought back then? And like, no, it wasn't. He debated with people who didn't have this view, and a number of scholars argue that European anti-Black racism, as well as the modern concept of what race is, actually develop in this period, and that Kant is a major player in this development. So there's debate about that. Some scholars, there's debate about the notions of race in the ancient Mediterranean, and there's debates about the development of the ideas of race in the European Middle Ages. But a lot of scholars think that our modern concept of race dates to this European Enlightenment period, and that there's an important relation between our modern concept of race and colonization, colonial science, colonial biology, of course, the slave trade, and then this really important question, what is the relation between these things and Enlightenment thought with its emphasis on human autonomy and reason? Okay, so one of our questions is, how should we interpret Kant's moral philosophy? Well, I'll just say a little bit more about the history of the race concept. So as I mentioned, so there are a lot of different topics we could look at in relation to Kant on race and racism. So one is Kant's racism and how that relates to his ideas, moral and political ideas. But another is that Kant really had a theory of race, and he's one of the first people to really try to develop a theory of race. So reading these thinkers who developed these ideas is an absolutely crucial part of the history of ideas, and including for understanding the modern concept of race. So there are a lot of parts of the classic modern conception of race, which sees humanity as divided into specific groups associated with continental origins, associated with specific observable physical features, notably skin color, and that we find in Kant's theory. Kant regards what he thinks of as racial characteristics as unfailingly heritable, and he associates them with inner structures which explain them. So these are all things which are in Kant's theory of race, and that are really central parts of the early modern conception of race that has come down to us. And so this is really the history of an incredibly important idea. So Justin Smith has an amazing book on the development of the early modern concept of race and the ideas of race in the early modern period. And he describes Kant's theory as one of the most formidable attempts in the modern period to treat the concept of race within the framework of a broader philosophical project. So there's all this colonial expansion happening in Europe. There's this colonial science happening, and people are starting to develop this concept of race. And Kant is an absolutely key player in the development of this concept. And that's a really interesting episode, an important episode in the history of ideas. So we can come back to talk about that for anyone who's interested. But I wanted to go on to this question of how should we interpret Kant's moral philosophy. So remember, I said that Kant's moral philosophy emphasizes these ideas of human equality and human autonomy, and what's wrong with treating humans as means, but yet he seems for a lot of his professional life to fail to condemn slavery, and he says racist things. Okay, so this is something which has Charles Mills has written a lot about, and the paper of his that I shared with you is called Kant's Untermenschen. So Mills argues that Kant's philosophy can only be made consistent with the idea of an Untermensch, a human who is not a moral person. So we've got this moral theory which says that all humans must be treated, all humans have dignity and autonomy and rights and must be respected. And then we have the proponent of that theory failing to seemingly failing to respect some humans. And Mills says, well, the only way to make these two things consistent is if actually he intends these moral and political ideas to apply basically to white men. And he thinks that there are other humans, but they're not moral persons. They're not bearers of dignity. They don't have the kind of autonomy that we should be respecting. Now, I've argued in a paper that I've shared with you that this move doesn't work for a number of reasons. And I think that this means that Kant can't be made fully consistent on race. Now, Pauline Kleingalt, who has written a lot of important work on this in this area, and I've also shared one of her papers with you, notices how much Kant's ideas on race change over time. And she argues that this happens under the pressure of his own theoretical commitments. And this is a really interesting point, because I'm wanting to talk a little bit about Kant's liberal political theory. And Kant develops his political theory very, very late in his career. And this is the moment in his life where his writing, where he seems to be the least racist. And in his very late political work, The Metaphysics of Morals, at this point, he does clearly condemn slavery, and he also condemns European colonialism. He condemns European colonialism in North America and the taking of land in North America. He defends the right of China and Japan to exclude European people if they want to, having seen what happened to India, which didn't exclude them. So it really is very clearly not only including European people. So I think Pauline Kleingalt does really have a case to be made in arguing that Kant's ideas change over time and improve. Now, Charles Mills, part of his target is that he says that a lot of Kant scholars, and I think this is a fair criticism, a lot of Kant scholars for a long time just kind of didn't look at Kant's racism. They were just like, well, that's not very nice, and we want to look at other parts of the theory, so we're just kind of going to pretend he didn't say those things and look at the parts of the theory that seem nicer to us. And Mills was trying to say, no, you can't do that if you're a serious scholar. And also, you can't just assume that this racism hasn't infected the rest of his theories. And I think that's right. We shouldn't assume that for any particular part of Kant's philosophy, that it isn't affected by his racism. We should treat it as an open question and take it case by case. So we shouldn't assume that any part of his work is innocent of his racism. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't assume that there aren't resources in his work that could be useful or true, including for understanding and addressing racism and sexism. So part of my argument for thinking that Mills' Untermensch proposal doesn't succeed involves looking at some of the notions in Kant's political philosophy, where it's very clear that he doesn't have a threshold notion of personhood. And even if he thought non-white people had lesser intelligence, it's pretty clear he doesn't take that to undermine personhood or to justify colonialism or slavery. Okay, so there being humans who are Untermenschen, liable to exploitation, is not compatible with Kant's moral and political philosophy. So I think, in response to Mills' valiant attempt to make Kant consistent on this topic, that Kant, in fact, can't be made consistent on this topic. Okay, so that was just a little brief overview of two issues in looking at Kant and race. One is Kant's theory of race, and the other is how to relate Kant's moral philosophy to his racism. And of course, we can come back to talk about those. But I'm just going to say a little bit about the second topic I want to touch on, and then we can take a break and have questions if there are any. So the second moment in Mills' critique that I want to talk about is his critique of what he and other people refer to as ideal theory in political philosophy. So Mills has written a lot about exclusions in Anglo-American political philosophy, and in particular about the fact that Anglo-American political philosophy has, he argues, and I think correctly, failed to pay much attention to theorizing racial domination and racial justice and racial injustice. And Mills argues that this is partly a function of its focus on what's called ideal theory. So there are different ways in which this debate between ideal theory and non-ideal theory is drawn. But one way of drawing this contrast is to see ideal theory as somebody who approaches the question of, for example, justice by trying to say, well, what would a perfectly just state look like? So they're trying to theorize what justice demands in a perfectly just society. And that means that they're precisely not trying to theorize oppression or domination. And as Mills notes, there's almost no work in mainstream Anglo-American political philosophy until very recently that's really trying to theorize oppression. So there are hundreds of books in mainstream political philosophy written on justice, but only one written on oppression. There's very little discussion of racial injustice. Mill's target at this point is primarily the political philosopher Rawls. Rawls sees himself as operating in a kind of Kantian framework. It's debate about exactly how much of Kant he's actually capturing, but that's how it's situated. And Mill says, well, if you look at this whole tradition, if you look at Rawls, you'll find in this enormous amount he wrote, you'll find like 2 footnotes on affirmative action and 6 pages on race. In all this work supposedly about justice written in the United States. And so he thinks it's a really problematic exclusion. And he thinks that this is actually a problem with ideal theory as an approach to political philosophy. He says that the focus on ideal theory functions to perpetuate racial domination because idealizing at the level of theory leads its proponents to idealizing their actual societies and overestimating how just they are. So I think this is a really interesting and really important critique. He says we've got this approach to political philosophy that talks about what an ideally just state would be like. And in particular, liberal political philosophy that starts by talking about autonomous individuals and their rights. And that this leads us to sort of imagine that we're living in roughly just liberal states that recognize everybody's rights. And Mills says that this can do a lot of harm. So he's written about this in a lot of different places in his book, The Racial Contract, and interesting papers on white ignorance. But the paper that I shared with you was his presidential address to the Second Central Division of the APA in 2018, called Through a Glass Whitely, Ideal Theory as Epistemic Injustice. And his concern in this paper is really with looking at the exclusions in Anglo-American political philosophy and the harms that are done to our theorizing by these exclusions. And he sees these exclusions as actually deeply implicated in liberal political philosophical thought, which he describes as the liberal thought of the last 200 years in terms of what he calls racial liberalism. And it describes a utopia, which he calls a whiteopia, because it's utopia for white people. His racial liberalism in the first stage of whiteopia will justify white racial domination, and then in the second stage, deny and obfuscate it. So he thinks that ideal political philosophy that just looks at ideal justice is actually, and our failure to sufficiently theorize racial injustice and to theorize oppression is actually obfuscating and denying a history of racial injustice and is doing serious harm as a result of this. Okay, I'm just going to say a couple more things about that and then we'll take a break. So Mills argues that when we look at the state of the Anglo-American political philosophy tradition's discussion of racial justice, if we look at his paper, White Ignorance, which is about cognitive deficiencies of the dominant group, he says you can actually just see the state of the tradition's discussion of racial justice as an expression of cognitive deficiencies of the dominator. The way he puts it is, he says it's the opacities of the epistemologies that come out of being in a position of dominance, and that Western philosophy's historical inadequacies on the theorization of social justice are most enlighteningly to be understood in relation to Western philosophy's demographic domination by political elites of one kind or another. So here we have a critique of liberal political philosophy as a whitewashed view of equality and cooperation amongst dominators defending their property interests. And liberal political philosophy, of course, focuses a lot on property, and that's a topic I'm going to come back to. So another person who joins Mill in part of this critique, philosopher Robert Bernasconi, has written a lot about racism. He's an important writer on racism in Kant, but also in other parts of the German idealist tradition. And he rejects what he calls the one-sided focus on the abstract individual removed from the concrete conditions in which he or she finds himself or herself, deprives us of the resources needed to identify and stay focused on the problems created by systemic racism. In this way, analytic reason and the dogmas associated with it serve to mask the real struggle. So Bernasconi here is not just criticizing bits of racism in the tradition, he's saying that this is actually embedded in the analytic method. And this means that we can't use this method for addressing and it's not going to be able to address the problems that it's caused. Now, interestingly, this is not true of Mill's. So I started with this idea that Kant's philosophy starts with abstraction and universalizing. Now, Mill's argues that we should not reject all universalizing and abstraction. We should reject doing it badly. It might still have some role to play. And that's something I want to come back to talk about quite a bit. And he doesn't argue that ideal theory has no use, but just that we should be aware of its possible harms. So some people just object to ideal theory as such, Amartya Sen possibly does. And Bernasconi, as we've just seen, rejects the idea, any kind of idea of abstraction. And Mills is worried about abstractions from social and political reality, but he does think that there is a possible use for idealizing and universalizing. So he thinks that ideal theory is harmful primarily in two ways. When it leads to our failing to theorize oppression sufficiently, and when it leads to our idealizing our actual circumstances, and therefore misunderstanding our actual circumstances. But Mill's response to that, unlike Bernasconi's, which is to reject analytic philosophy and any possibility of abstraction and universalizing, Mill's response to that, and that's the third moment that I want to turn to in his work on Kant, and I'll do that after the break, is to rethink that tradition. And that's what he's doing in Black Radical Kantianism, Black Radical Liberalism, and Occupy Liberalism. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that part of Mill's, but let's take a break and talk about the first two parts, which are looking at Kant's racism, Kant's theory of race, and exclusions in this ideal theory tradition. So if anybody has questions on that, we can chat about that for 10 or 15 minutes and then come back to the second part.
Okay. So Helga will be moderating this section, so go ahead.
So we roughly do this up until maybe 6 o'clock, right? On depending a little bit on,
yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, good. So if people have questions, if you type them, I'll read them. And that also gives Lucy, 10 seconds to think about the question, and then she will respond. Or you can rest a little bit, but don't be bashful. It's not called bashful, actually, in English, is it? Just don't hold back. She's a tough cookie. She can take any question.
But also we can, there's not a lot of questions now. We can continue and have some more at the end. I thought people might want a little bit of break from hearing me.
I think they're seizing the opportunities. So here comes the first question, and it's from Laurie Johnson. And she says, Lucy may address this later in the talk, but I'm interested in connections between Kant and anthropology of his time regarding race. I'm thinking of Blumenbach, Buffon, etc.
I might direct this one to Helga, who knows Kant's anthropology better than I do. And yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I'm not actually going to talk a lot about it more. I'm just going to talk about liberal political thought. So I think, it's a huge and really important issue. Kant himself regards himself as having what he calls an anthropology. It's unclear how, if at all, that relates to what people think of as anthropology today. And it's unclear how, so I started off by saying that Kant starts with this interest in universal, abstract, a priori conditions of the possibility of various human phenomena. And that means that he is not centrally doing empirical work or centrally very knowledgeable, but he is in weird ways interested in empirical, he's incredibly interested in empirical science, and he's also interested in something like, well, what he regards as anthropology. This is just, I'm failing to work out a way of dealing with this question in a quick way. It's an enormous question.
It is, and I don't mind coming into and having conversation maybe later a little bit about anthropology, but there's so many questions. So if we just hear some of them anyway, and then I'll do one, and then at some point I'll just speed them up and read them out so that you can perhaps deal with some of them in the rest of the talk, okay? The next one is from Angela Ting, and she says, they say, what exactly is Kant's theory on race? What are some racist specifics that he mentions?
So the main thing, so Kant, in common with basically the early modern conception of race as it features in a lot of other people, associates the races with groups who look a bit differently, particularly having differences in skin color, which is linked to continental origins. So what he's trying to, so that's kind of common to a bunch of people at this time. And then what Kant is trying to theorize in a weird way, which involves a weird mixture of empirical and a priori components, he's trying to theorize what makes some of these characteristics racial. So he thinks that what he comes up with is that the racial characteristics are the ones which are unfailingly hereditary. So that's a contrast in his account between skin color and eye color, where he thinks that skin color is always passed on to some degree, but eye color isn't, and he obviously just doesn't know anything about genetics. And then he has a further postulation, which is that there were some original humans who had inside them the capacities to develop in response to different environments. So the capacities to develop darker skin or lighter skin, or and then these sort of innate things which were present in the original humans get triggered by particular geographical environments and then become unfailingly hereditary. So he's trying to, he's trying to think about how they could be these things called races, these divisions of humans into groups, not knowing anything about genetics, and trying to postulate a mechanism by which there could be some characteristics which are racial, which actually divide these groups into different groups. And I think when you try to see him trying to theorize about this, you actually see a number of tensions in the very idea of race. So the divisions that he introduces in thinking about which groups are the races actually change in different iterations of his theory of race. Now, I've got a colleague here in San Diego, Michael Hardeman, who, in tension with sort of current theoretical, philosophical, and critical theory orthodoxy, Michael wants to defend what he calls minimal race realism. So he wants to argue, most contemporary scholars think that races don't exist. Racialized groups exist. Races don't exist biologically, they only exist socially. So as racialized groups that have been believed to be racist. Now, Michael wants to defend minimal race realism, and that requires thinking that there is some sort of specified level of division. And I think you can already see that as a problem in Kant's theory, the way he divides the races up differently in different iterations of his theory. So there's lots more to be said about this, but I think Helga has a bunch more questions, so I feel I shouldn't go on about it at too much length. I'll just say one quick thing, which is that Kant's theory, he is trying to develop a sort of a race realism and a theoretical explanation of it. That part of it isn't in itself hierarchical. He is a racist, but this theoretical attempt to think about race realism wouldn't have to in itself be hierarchical.
It just becomes hierarchical, and yes. So Germans end up quite high, or certainly white. Right? Okay, so we're still going to go back to talk. There's 3 minutes and there's 4 questions. I'm just going to read them and think a bit about them, and then we bring them with us, okay? So Blair Winter asks, I'd love an example of idealist theory appreciated as having a useful application. Timothy McDunn asks, are there examples of scholars applying these or similar racial criticism against the continental or phenomenological tradition? Kathy McCarthy, she asks, the argument for continuing to review Kant's theories and use this work as historical account makes sense. But are there other scholars that could be uplifted or that share a more anti-racist view? Could Kant be mentioned as an important scholar of the time, but other scholars be given more class time, research space for review? So probably you're thinking about transcendental idealist or theories, German idealist theories. Has probably an idea for next year, like should we do Hegel instead or something? Has anyone considered the historical context around Kant's shift in thinking about race? It could be argued that this change did not take place under the weight of his own theory, as Kleingeld suggests. So you have about 2 minutes to answer all of that before you go on with the talk.
So I'm just going to say a few quick things. So the very first question about good uses of universal and idealization, I'm going to come back. That's what I'm going to talk about quite a bit more. In terms of looking at racism in the phenomenological tradition or continental philosophy, Bernasconi has written a lot about that. And I mean, obviously, there's lots of work on Heidegger's anti-Semitism. But yes, so there's definitely work on that. In terms of course, this is a question I'm sure Helga and I have both been asked before. Why are you trying to rehabilitate this guy? Why not just sort of note these problems and move on to some people who've seem to be have basically more progressive thoughts? Well, so I mean, there's really an enormous amount to be said about that. But I do think that there is something incredibly fascinating and powerful in the bits of Kant that I'm looking at today, but I actually think in other parts of his work too, in his moral and political philosophy, which we're talking about today, but also in his metaphysics, that are they're deeply influential in huge parts of our tradition. So you know, the whole phenomenological tradition is embedded in Kant's theoretical philosophy. Contemporary analytic philosophy is, German idealism is, liberal political thought is. So we do need to come to grips with these ideas. But also I think there is really, so this is, you know, this is the point that I really want to take off from, looking at Mill's Black radical Kantianism. The thought is that Mills is trying to put forward, and which I think is actually a really interesting thought, is that there is radical potential in this tradition that has been underappreciated, both by its proponents and by its critics. And that this is a more powerful tradition than both, in some ways, than both its proponents and its critics have taken it to be, and that it's worth really rethinking these ideas along those lines. Now, of course, there are other thinkers also one can look at, and I'm definitely not making any arguments against that. We all have, in terms of our research, the ideas that just kind of fascinate us and that we want to understand better. And Helga and I think both, that happens to include Kant. But there's no reason why people wouldn't be interested in other things. And from the point of view of teaching, I think certainly we should include other things. But I do think that there are ideas in this tradition that are really worth coming to grips with, and that shouldn't be underestimated. So, and that's really the thing that I want to go on to look at in looking at this third moment of Mill's engagement with Kant, which is his Black radical Kantianism, because that's kind of the response that Mills wants to have to liberalism. Okay, but before talking about that, let me just about the final question, which was about why Kant's ideas changed. So I'm not sure what other kinds of thoughts the questioner had in mind, but we could come back to talk about that later. So Pauline Kleindel's postulation is that it's under the weight of his own theoretical assumptions leads him to change his mind. That's kind of that's sort of a autobiographical postulation. I don't think she particularly has textual evidence for that, in the sense of, you know, Kant is not one of, or maybe very few philosophers are, but Kant doesn't, when he radically changes his mind, write in his texts, I used to think this, I was wrong, now I think that. He just almost never says that. So there are major shifts in his theoretical philosophy that are just kind of unmarked, and then he starts having some new idea and he writes about it as if it's just obviously true, and he doesn't say, oh, I used to think this other thing. He's like, well, this is obviously why you have to think this. So he doesn't himself flag very often changes in his views. So when we're trying to think about whether and how his views changed, we're often speculating, and there's often a lot of debate about whether and how his views have changed. So when we're postulating something like this, like does the offensiveness of his racist views change over time, and why might that have happened? You know, we're going to be just doing autobiographical speculation, I think, primarily. I don't know how much evidence there would be in the text to directly give us explanations of that. Maybe others will have more thoughts about that, so we can come back to that. So we've looked at these two moments in Charles Mill's engagement with Kant, which is that Mills has spent a lot of time pointing out Kant's racism in the face of generations of Kant scholars who've paid almost no attention to it, because they want to look at what they think are the pure and interesting parts of his thought. And then Mills has also got this critique of ideal theory, which Kant's philosophy could be situated in, but I would want to argue that Kant's political philosophy actually has very importantly mix of ideal and non-ideal concerns. So I think it's not straightforwardly an ideal theory, but Mill's critique here is important. But how does Mills respond to this? Bernasconi responds by just saying we've got to reject this whole tradition, this whole way of thinking, the methods involved in this philosophical tradition we should reject. Mills's response is we should reclaim liberalism. And so he has this recent book, Black Rights, White Wrongs, in which I think maybe all three of these essays are in that book. But he's got this really interesting essay, Occupy Liberalism, where he's saying, yes, there's another essay called Racial Liberalism, where he says, yes, we must note how supposedly liberal political thought through the history of the last 200 years has been implicated in racism. But what should we conclude from that? Should we conclude that the ideas of human equality and autonomy are wrong? Mill says we should rather try to reclaim this tradition and rethink what progressive and radical potential there might be in it. Okay, so we've got this question, what is liberalism? And I started off by noting that in South Africa, liberal means right wing, and in large parts of North America, it means left wing, and in Britain, it apparently means centrist, and it's totally unclear what liberalism means. So we've got this question, what is liberalism? And if we're trying to answer that question, one thing we could do is we could just look back at, what have liberal thinkers thought? Well, we'll find a lot of people who presented themselves as liberal thinkers defending slavery. And then we could say, well, liberalism is a political philosophy that's compatible with slavery. Or we could say, well, what are the ideas in these political thinkers claiming, and are they compatible with slavery, and are they consistent, and aren't things maybe a lot more complicated than that? So Mill says, liberalism has always been the dominant ideology in the United States. Liberalism in the United States has historically been complicit with plutocracy, patriarchy, and white supremacy. But this complicity is a contingent function of dominant group interests rather than the result of an immanent conceptual logic. So he wants to argue that it's not actually immanent in the basic ideas that liberalism claims to have, but rather in something else. So his strategy is that we should rethink what liberalism should be, including what a serious liberal philosophy that's engaging with racial justice and thinking about past and present injustice should be. So this is, in a way, this question about Mill's question about liberalism, sort of parallel to our question about Kant's moral philosophy. So Kant is a racist, but he thinks that all humans have dignity and ought to be respected. Can the exclusions and complicities and the racism be taken out of the doctrine, or is the doctrine just totally infected by them? So we've got a doctrine which in its actual incarnations has been racist and exclusionary, and which in its idealizations may do harm. And it's presenting itself as describing reality. So in a context in which people are not recognized as social equals, talking about ideals of social equality can actually do harm. But Mill's response is, but we shouldn't therefore reject the ideals of social equality. Okay, so here's a sort of a parallel case, and this is also a case that Mills discusses. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal. Now, as you will probably know, this was written by a slave owner, and it seems to only talk about men, not about women. So here we've got this claim, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created equal, that is clearly, presumably, not intended by the person saying it to apply to all humans. So supposedly universal claims can, of course, be asserted with massive hypocrisy. And another important figure in this tradition, John Locke, as you may know, also an important thinker in liberal political thought, and participated in writing slave constitutions for slave states and defending basically land appropriation. So these claims this can look like a noble idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal. but is it really meant to apply to all people? Obviously, we need to ask that. So one really serious harm that can be caused by these ideal claims is when they're asserted with complete hypocrisy. So by slave owners, so saying that all men are created equal. Another harm that these ideal claims can do is that they can distract our attention from non-ideal differences, ways in which in actual circumstances people aren't treated equally. So this is part of Mills's point, that it can lead to our idealizing our understanding of our actual societies and failing to theorize oppression. And they can distract from particular differences in context which make a difference to what we need to do to realize human equality in a particular context. You know, so there's a lot of work. People who are working in feminism may know Serena Cater's book, Decolonizing Universalism, where she's looking at criticizing, she calls Western feminists who will want to argue against things like veiling in the Muslim world. And she's saying, you know, they're not understanding what would be the best step to realizing human equality in this particular context and what the particular features of it are. And these ideal claims can be asserted misleadingly or falsely. So universalizations can be misleading and false. They can be hypocritical. They can be distracting. They can fail to help us understand. This is one of a common critique of ideal theory. They don't help us understand how to get to the ideal case from where we actually are. But, so these are all important problems. But would we want to conclude from taking seriously any of those problems that people shouldn't have equal fundamental rights and people don't have equal value? So I myself would not want to conclude that. I would want to say these are all really important problems we must pay attention to, but in fact, there are important ways in which all humans are equal in value and should have equal rights. And that, in fact, asserting and understanding what that means is part of what it is to theorize and reject oppression, hierarchy, domination, and injustice. So we need to note the harmful ways in which these abstractions can be used, but it doesn't follow that there couldn't be any true universal claims about human value, and those claims might actually be important for theorizing justice. Okay, so I think that's where Mills is situating himself in his attempts to occupy liberalism and develop what he calls Black radical liberalism. So he wants to say, this tradition has presented us with a whitewashed view of our societies, and that's problematic. And this tradition has failed to theorize oppression, and that's problematic. But it does not need to follow from that we want to reject the ideas of human equality and the ideas of fundamental rights, which this tradition is based on. And that means we don't necessarily want to reject the ways of thinking about political authority and political justice that could be found in these traditions if we were to rethink it. Okay, so this is Mill's sort of challenge to us, to rethink these traditions. Now, I mentioned Mill's diagnosis of white ignorance and possible distortions in the way that ideal theory leads us to underattend to dominance and oppressions in our own societies. And of course, one result of this could be that these liberal theories themselves haven't been adequately understood, including by their own proponents. So, an interesting part of this critique, so both Mills and Bernasconi, as I've mentioned, diagnose inappropriate universalizing and abstracting as part of what has gone wrong in the dominant Anglophone philosophical tradition. Mills is, as I noted, more optimistic about the possibility of more appropriate universalizing and abstracting. But this view also applies to how we read the history of philosophy. And I think it particularly applies to this problematic, difficult, and brilliant figure who is our focus today, Immanuel Kant. So getting it wrong as to where the universalizing, the abstracting, and the a priori moves are happening leads to worse readings of Kant. So we had a little brief discussion in the question period that I didn't give any kind of adequate answer to about anthropology. And Kant is interested in empirical things to do with anthropology, and he's interested in these a priori conditions. And quite often people have taken some a priori part of Kant's philosophy and have said, oh, well, this is Kant's account of what it would be to lead a good human life. And it's never meant to be an account of all of that. It's meant to be an account of some very abstract component which plays a role in thinking about that. So if we get it wrong as to where the universalizing and the abstracting is happening, we misread the theory. And readings of Kant in the last couple of decades have become immeasurably richer as people have paid more attention to the fact that his a priori account of the conditions of the possibility of various phenomena are not meant to be complete accounts of the phenomena in question. He does have concerns with empirical and situated subjects. In fact, I would argue, and we might have a bit of time to discuss this at the end, that Kant has very far from seeing humans as rational atoms. Kant, in fact, sees us as radically disordered, self-deceived, opaque to ourselves. And I would argue he sees this as being a function precisely of our situatedness. And I think that our view of Kant as presenting isolated, individualist, atomic, logical, liberal agents transparent to themselves is a function of the very epistemic deficiencies of the interpretive tradition that Mills has talked about. So this is part of what I wanted to say in the beginning, that we shouldn't be too sure that we already know what is contained in the ideas in this tradition. So certainly people who object to a situated, a contextualized, transparent to themselves liberal atoms, that is not an idea to be found in Kant. One could only think one was finding that in Kant if one took his a priori account of this meta-ethical structure of moral thought to be an account of human agency, but he doesn't take it that way. I think the tradition has read it that way, and I think Mills has some explanations of part of how and why the tradition has gone wrong in reading it that way. But I think that we should reread it, and I think that this is important not just because we're trying to rehabilitate some particular dead white guy, but because we want to understand what's really contained in these ideas, how we really think about human autonomy and human situated autonomy and human situated autonomy in conditions of injustice given our human nature. And I think it gives us a really rich framework for thinking about those, and one which its own proponents have not done a good job at thinking through, partly because they've understood it as being more abstract and a priori than it really is. So in Mill's work on Kant's racism, he wants to point out that Kant's interpreters have failed to understand, have interpreted him too charitably in failing to pay attention to his racism. I'm suggesting, and Mills also suggests in his work on Black radical liberalism and Black radical Kantianism, that in addition to interpreting Kant too charitably by failing to pay attention to his racism, it could also be that racism in the tradition following Kant has led to not interpreting some of the resources in his view radically enough. So where the hypocrisy of Enlightenment liberalism may have resulted in the assumption by its proponents of being roughly in conditions of liberal justice, the tradition may have failed to interrogate what is really required of equal freedom. So the tradition that has assumed, so remember I pointed out that this one of these critiques of ideal theory is that it leads to our idealizing our understanding of our actual societies. And, you know, it's easy to see this effect, you know, when people talk about the United States as the world's oldest democracy. And at the point at which the United States was created as a country, I don't know, what percentage of people could vote? A third? No women, no black people, no non-property owners. Really, that's our idea of democracy? That's not anybody's idea of democracy. How can this be the world's oldest democracy? But we've got this story, this oldest democracy. So we've got this massively idealizing story. And the story, of course, leads to failing to pay attention and theorizing these really severe injustices. And Mill's thought, which I'm trying to convince you of, it's my thought too, is that this is also true of our interpreting of this tradition, our interpreting of what is really required by equal freedom. If we've taken the equal freedom of liberal political thought to be roughly describing contemporary liberal democracies with their actual histories, then maybe we have no idea at all what equal freedom would really require, and we need to go back to this tradition and think it out. So one could reject liberalism as a compromised and conservative bourgeois ideology defending status quo property rights. So this is now, of course, the left critique of liberalism, not the parts of the United States that think liberalism is communism. But one could also argue that elite interests have distorted beyond recognition what liberalism should be, given its own starting points. Now, whether or not you want to agree with that in the end, or whether that would be enough to make you sympathetic to this political philosophy, it's definitely worth thinking through. So left critics of liberalism who don't want to buy into Mill's project, I think it's definitely an important challenge he's raising to think through what really, have we really understood the resources in this tradition? Might it be more radical than we've taken it to be? So Mill's, let me just note that in Mill's, so Mill's is trying to motivate for rethinking liberalism. In his work on Kant, when he does this, so he's got this paper, Black Radical Kantianism, he talks there about Kant's moral philosophy. In my view, he totally underestimates the resources in Kant's political philosophy. This isn't really a criticism of Mills. Mills is not a Kant scholar. He's not trying to be a Kant scholar, So he's just looking at Kant's moral philosophy. He is trying to argue that liberal political thought is more radical than it's been thought to be, but he doesn't look to, I think, the right places in Kant's political philosophy to do that, because he doesn't really look to Kant's political philosophy. He looks to Kant's moral philosophy. There are important ideas there too, but I want to talk a little bit about Kant's political philosophy. So Kant's political philosophy is based on the idea of freedom, that politics starts with the idea that each individual human has an innate right to freedom, and that we need to reconcile this with state power. So when we form states, we create authorities that have the power to make and coerce laws, and we need to reconcile this with each individual's right to freedom. And he argues that only in a just state with the rule of law can we respect each other's freedom. Now, there's one way of thinking about freedom, a sort of a frontier way of thinking about freedom, which I think has some resonance in this country, where people imagine that we would be more free without the rule of law, and that the law enforcement is always an infringement of freedom. So they might think, well, you know, unfortunately we need the rule of law because people aren't very nice to each other, but law enforcement is always an infringement of freedom. Kant thinks that if you have just law, justice, just political relations make us free in a way that we wouldn't be without it. So if we didn't have just political relations, and the rule of law required to establish just political relations, we would be less free than we are with this. Okay, so that's sort of the background of his political philosophy. And it is definitely liberal political philosophy in central ways that left critics of liberalism object to. So left critics of liberalism object to starting with autonomy as a fundamental value, which is, this goes back to the idea of seeing atomized autonomous agents rather than dependent and related and situated agents. It starts with the idea of equal freedom, and left critics see this as problematic because they think that defending freedom is only defending us. Liberalism has traditionally understood this in terms of negative freedom. So defending us from interference by other people, but not enabling, not giving material conditions, meeting material needs. And Kant's political philosophy starts with the idea of property. And this obviously is, left critics think that this is why they think it's just sort of a bourgeois defense of status quo property rights. So there are these three central ideas in Kant's political philosophy that are ideas which left critics of liberalism would want to focus on. But I want to persuade you that it's worth thinking these ideas as they appear in his thought. So Kant does start with autonomy as a fundamental moral value, but Kant's notion of autonomy is very much not something like individual choosing. It's certainly not, it's certainly not like individual choosing in commercial circumstances of late capitalism. Kant's notion of autonomy, it's something actually quite strange and quite complicated. It's thoroughly relational. It's not about individualist choosing. It's a matter of recognizing reasons for action grounded in respecting the humanity of each person as a constraint on what counts as a reason for acting. So it's about mutual recognition of a kind of value between agents who see themselves simultaneously constrained by each other's values. So it's a thoroughly relational, and coming back to the point about getting the abstraction in the right place, it's much, much more abstract than what people think about when they talk about individualist autonomous choosing. So there's an enormous amount to be said about that, and we can certainly come back to it, but I'm going to go through that relatively quickly. Kant starts with equal freedom as a fundamental political value, and certainly left critics of liberalism think that the problem with this is that it defends us only from non-interference. But on Kant's account, there is no coherent account of equal freedom that involves only negative freedom. There are forms of inequality which undermine equal freedom, and securing equal freedom has substantial material and institutional implications. Now, as Susan said in introducing me, my area of expertise is actually Kant's theoretical philosophy. In terms of expertise on these parts of Kant, the ideas that I'm really talking about now, you luckily have at your university one of the world's leading experts. So Helga can certainly, for anybody who's interested in these ideas, she's written a lot about the extent to which securing equal freedom in Kant's account has substantial material implications. So this is not a decontextualized account of autonomy and freedom that is just about protecting non-interference. And there's lots more to be said about that. But I want to talk a little bit more about the idea of property. And I think, how long do we still have? A few more minutes to talk and then questions, is that right?
Yeah, so we have 15 minutes with Q&A. So if you do like...
Okay, so I should wrap up. Okay, so Kant starts with the idea of property, what property is and what could justify it. How do individuals and communities get to be entitled to exclude others from property? He thinks we need property for agency, and it follows from that everybody should have some means, which is partly why he is concerned with the connection between freedom and material means required to enable it, which is why, as Helge Varden has argued, his account supports redistributive taxation. But really interestingly, importantly, he thinks there aren't conclusive property relations until we're living under justice. And this is an absolutely fascinating part of his political philosophy, which I think really requires an enormous amount more thinking. And the area that I'm trying to think it through, and I'm just going to talk about this for 1 minute so we can have time for questions, is how this relates to how we think about so-called free market theory. Because in addition to this, for the way in which this liberal tradition has understood itself, in addition to all its problems with racism and patriarchy, it's understood as defending a certain kind of conception of free market theory, which lots of people understand in terms of competitive market theory and economics. And I think that there's just absolutely no way you could take it in that way if you really try to think it through. And you try to think through what economic justice in an account of politics that starts with freedom would really lead to. So libertarian versions of so-called free market theory appeal to the freedom to do whatever you want with your own property to justify unregulated markets. This, of course, assumes just initial acquisition, another harm of ideal theory, because obviously that's never the actual case in our actual world. And it presupposes natural property rights which exist independently of the state. So just flagging to you how interesting and important theorizing property is. But what I just want to note is that it confuses markets in the sense of competitive markets as described by the idealizing assumptions of market theory with markets in the sense in which nobody interferes. And this is another, I think, enormous area in which ideal theory has done incredible harm, which is competitive market theory in economics, which describes economies under idealized conditions which don't even vaguely begin to apply. For example, competitive economic market theory theorizes goods and services circulating in a closed loop, not drawing materials from anywhere or dumping waste into anywhere. It also assumes that there are no freely engaged in transactions which have impacts on anyone else. Okay, so competitive market theory obviously doesn't begin to apply to the real world, but this is an ideal theory which has had, I think, these two harms that Mills wants to point to in an incredibly severe way. The harm of failing to theorize our actual situation carefully enough, which, as we all know, is absolutely crucial as the resources of our planet are about to be extinguished, and thinking that we are actually in a more idealizing our actual situation. So we have this neat little competitive market theory, and it leads to our thinking, well, we're sort of in free market conditions, aren't we? When we aren't even slightly in them, and the conditions that the theory describes don't even slightly apply. So thinking about what property relations and markets and economies would look like on the account of freedom that this theory should be based in, I think would lead us to something radically different from competitive market theory because of the ways in which the idealized conditions it describes don't actually apply. Okay, so there's an enormous amount to be said about that, but I'm just going to finally end by mentioning that on Kant's account, as I read him, when we are situated in conditions of injustice, we are always in positions in which we're constantly, let me say, in positions in which all our options for acting involve treating others wrongly, and this can have effect on ourselves, making it incredibly difficult for us to understand ourselves and leading to self-deception and delusional ideology. And I just wanted to mention that as a final thought, showing the extent to which Kant himself, no matter what the tradition following him might have, does not have an unsituated, transparent, atomized liberal self. Okay, so I will stop with that. Obviously, I went very rapidly through that last bit about property, but we can talk more about that.
Okay, so as people are getting their questions ready, I talk very slowly, but I really do, if we have 30 seconds when people are just getting it ready, I would love you to talk a little bit more about this idea that you have on evil in Kant, or how it is that we are not a coherent self, because I think it's such a rich idea, and it went so fast at the end. So as people are writing and typing, maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
So I'll just say a couple of things about that. So it's a pretty complicated idea, actually, and it involves putting together Kant's account of justice with his account of autonomy and moral reason as a way of explaining this weird idea he has in his late philosophy of the ways that, I mean, he calls it radical evil, but it's really an account of the way in which human subjects in the actual human condition are radically self-deceived and not transparent to themselves, and radically sort of disordered and badly structured. And my thought is to explain that. So that's definitely something he thinks, indisputably, but it's less clear how to put that together with the rest of his thought. And my thought is that actually it follows from putting together his account of justice and injustice with his account of moral reason. So his account, I'll just say very briefly why I think that's true. So his account of justice requires, really, he thinks that we can't, so he thinks that justice requires just relations between individuals, require just political authority. And just political authority requires just international relations. So it requires just states with just relations to each other and just relations between individuals and states they're not members of. And until we have that, we're not situated rightfully in relation to each other. And when we're not in conditions of justice, which is our condition, we're situated wrongly in relation to other human beings. And when that's the case, our moral options for relating to each other can be flawed in ways which we can't escape. So all of our options for acting can be problematic. And in circumstances where all of our actions, all of our options involve complicity, so I was mentioning just briefly at the end, imminent climate catastrophe. Now, there's very little you can do in your life that isn't actually complicit in that. And how do we think about ourselves while taking on board our actual personal moral complicity in this? It's very hard to really take that on board. In fact, it's very hard to fully make sense of our moral options and our moral lives when all of our options for acting are tainted.
Yeah.
And in those conditions, Kant thinks, I think, we are incredibly drawn to self-deceptive ways of thinking about ourselves and our options as if we're better than we are, rather than taking seriously how problematic our options for actions are. And in fact, it's almost, I think it's almost impossible on his account of moral reason and his account of justice to get a determinate sense of what your obligations are when you're situated in conditions of injustice. And that means that it's actually impossible to be this transparent, atomized liberal subject. And so we're always going to be involved in some badly structured, self-deceptive ways, which could be less bad or more bad, all the way, you know, they can get bad all the way to sort of radically delusional ideology. And so understanding that, understanding how our situation contributes to that is something we basically just have to be constantly on the look for. As I understand his account of the self. So that's just, there's obviously lots more to be said about that, but I think we should let some other voices be heard.
Yes, super interesting. So we have 3 questions and we have 6 minutes. So I think I'm going to read them and then you can engage with them because there isn't enough time if we do one on each. So first from Mojer Tabon. Mills argues that for Kant, not all humans are granted personhood, namely Black people, people of color, and women, and that white maleness is central to personhood in his estimation. In his Observations on the Beautiful and Sublime, Kant writes that he finds it hard to believe that women have principles, which is what Mills and Loudon base their criticism that women are not granted personhood. Kleingeld argues that such an extrapolation is presentist, and despite his racism and sexism, Kant views all humans as being endowed with reason and therefore persons. Is there anything in Kant's work that suggests the relationship between principle and reason, and thus personhood? It's the first one. I'm going to read the next two. So Sasha McDowell, what do you think about Kant's ideas on freedom and autonomy in regard to the current mask debates in the US, i.e. wearing a mask inhibits the wearer's freedom or freedoms? And then last question, Alexis Jordan Webb. It feels like because Kant is centuries old, the fact that he was a racist is glossed over, and academia works to focus more on finding the value in his work or defending them, considering his work foundational or classic. This seems to be a trend across humanities in general, like with Shakespeare's sexism and Wagner's anti-Semitism being pushed aside and to instead teach on their genius. In our current age, I feel like we would completely disregard someone's work if they were outwardly racist, sexist, etc. How do researchers deal with this, especially now with more accountability being demanded?
Well, I think I might take those backwards in order. So on the last one, I think, this work that I'm talking about today and the work that I've written, that Mills has written, and that Kleingeld has written, those are all, I think, examples of part of the way in which people deal with this. And Helga Waden's recent book on gender, sex, and sexuality in Kant is another example of part of how people are dealing with this. So I think that it might be true that there was that it has been in the past that people just look at venerated thinkers without looking at their faults and mistakes, or worse than mistakes. I think that is less true now. And I think that my argument would be that we should neither just reject nor venerate these thinkers. And we should look at all these problems in them, including to be very careful about looking at how and why they go wrong. So we should look at their mistakes very carefully, but we shouldn't take it that because they do go wrong, that there's nothing of value in these thoughts, in these thinkers. And I think if we did that, I think we would lose interesting ideas which are worth thinking about. I think we would be liable to underestimating how likely we are to be making similar mistakes. And I think that's incredibly important, because there's no reason to think that thinkers of the past got stuff wrong while thinking about justice, but we don't do that today. And I think, in fact, looking in detail at how brilliant people theorizing equality and going very wrong, how and why they go wrong is really important to understand how we might go wrong. But I also think that it would be a mistake to think that we could only learn from pure thinkers who haven't gone terribly wrong. And so one of the incredibly important thinkers in American political thought, Frederick Douglass, there's so much one can learn from his writing. What you might not agree with everything about him politically, but while still thinking you could learn from him. But he said absolutely terrible things about Native Americans. And it just doesn't follow from that he isn't an important and amazing figure. I mean, there's something disturbing and tragic about these terrible things he says. And I think we need to just face that and think about it in all of these people, and not make the mistake of thinking that there could be some pure thinkers who we should learn from, who haven't gone terribly wrong. Obviously lots more that could be said about that. Looks like Helga wants to.
So we have to wrap up. So a little bit on the mask, and then a little bit on principle and reason.
Yeah, so on the mask thing, Kant's account of freedom is that we are all entitled to freedom that is compatible with equal freedom for everyone else. And that is certainly compatible with restrictions on us. So we wouldn't all be more free if we could just drive on whatever side of the road we wanted. We are all more free because everybody agrees to drive on one side of the road. So there are restrictions that can be imposed on us that defend and enable everybody's equal freedom. And some of those could be restrictions that are defending public health, that are not compatible with freedom if they're compatible with everybody's equal freedom. So I don't think Kant would have any problem with the idea that we should wear masks if it's needed for public health. I wasn't sure if I fully got the point of the first question. There was a lot of complexity in it. So Helga, yeah, you're gonna.
Yeah. So now I think Susan is trying also. So let's do. It's just principle and reason, right?
Yes.
It's a necessary relationship. Principle, reason, and personhood.
So the question was raised in the context of asking whether Kant thinks that women aren't capable of principles and therefore don't have personhood. Mm. And so I don't know how to start on this in a quick amount of time. I think it's clear that Kant does think that women have reason, and that they have the kind of reason that is required for moral responsibility and therefore for personhood. And he, along with a lot of other sexist thinkers, thinks that women should be held morally responsible and can be blamed and can be held criminally responsible. And that shows that he has to think that they have whatever kind of reason is sufficient for moral responsibility. So lots of sexist thinkers of the past who didn't think that women should have the vote thought that women could be tried in criminal trials. Now you can't, so that's just a kind of a crazy inconsistency. And one can think about how best to explain that inconsistency, but I think that that's what it is.
Susan?
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you so much for a fascinating lecture, and thank everyone as well for coming, and Helga for moderating this conversation. Thank you so much. That was incredible.
I'm sorry we didn't, I didn't leave more time to hear from all of you a bit, but there's so much to be said.
So much. Thank you so much for coming. Take care.
Pleasure.